Another empire from the 19th century would also start discovering Ibn Khaldun and reinterpreting his writings, the French. If the Ottomans were in a state of decline in the 19th century before collapsing in the early 20th century, France was expanding its colonial empire, sometimes at the expense of territories under Ottoman suzerainty, like Algeria, where Ibn Khaldun has written his Muqaddimah and spent a significant part of his life. And that is precisely the reason behind the French growing interest for Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun was already known among small circles of French Orientalists, like Barthélemy d'Herbelot de Molinville, who was heavily drawing from Khatib Chelebi's work. Ibn Khaldun was also starting to be nicknamed among Orientalists the Arab Montesquieu. Montesquieu was one of the main figures of what the West calls the Enlightenment period in France. He is most notably famous for theorizing the separation of powers, or what we call in today's political systems, check and balances, between the legislative, the executive, and the judicial power. He has also contributed to the Encyclopédie and has written Lettres persanes, Persian letters, an epistolary novel where he recounts the experience of two Persian noblemen in France, a novel satirizing and criticizing French society from their fictitious eyes. And last but not least, he has written a book on the causes of the Roman successive rise and decadence, in a somewhat similar way to Ibn Khaldun, but without knowing him. However, Ibn Khaldun's name would fully start to be publicized in the West by the French Orientalist Sylvestre de Sacy at the beginning of the 19th century, who would translate small excerpts from the Muqaddimah. De Sacy's role was crucial in the spread of Orientalism in academia, as he taught most of the next generation of Orientalists across France and Europe, including the Egyptologist Champollion, who is credited for being the first to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Two other Sylvestre de Sacy students undertook the editing and translating of the Muqaddimah, Étienne Quatremer and William McGucking, Baron de Slane. Both contributed to modestly put Ibn Khaldun on the European intellectual map. But this was due to another event, the brutal invasion of Algeria in 1830, which would last more than 130 years. That event meant that many French scholars and statesmen were interested in making sense of their newly conquered population, their social systems, their customs, their histories, and their tribes, and thus were very interested in what Ibn Khaldun had to say about the Arabs and Amazigh, or Berbers, living in the Maghreb. Because Ibn Khaldun was providing them a unique historical resource on the region. Actually, knowing about their new indigenous subjects was a great way to better predict their behavior, and eventually control them. The French at the time were exploiting more intensely Ibn Khaldun's history of North Africa than his theories of the Muqaddimah, which, for the French, were not of much use. Ibn Khaldun had written a universal book about history, societies, economies, dynasties, and states, but the French were mostly seeing in it a book on North African tribes. In 1840, Baron de Slane was commissioned by the French Ministry of War on several missions to colonize Algeria. In Algiers, capital of Algeria, Baron de Slane first translated the Ta'rif, Ibn Khaldun's autobiography, followed by large excerpts of the Kitab al-Ibar, the multi-volume book following the Muqaddimah, dealing with the history of the Amazigh and Arabs. Eventually, he published a full translation of the Muqaddimah. Baron de Slane had to deal with the difficulty of properly rendering Ibn Khaldun's letter and spirit into another language. For example, he translated the keyword asabiya as esprit de corps, which catches some of the meaning of the word, but not perfectly. And that would lead to the later voluntary or involuntary misinterpretation of Ibn Khaldun's book, especially by influential Orientalists and teachers working in French Algeria, who weaponized Ibn Khaldun to justify their colonial narrative. Professors like Émile-Félix Gautier, who taught in the University of Algiers for over 30 years during the colonial era, quoted Ibn Khaldun selectively and inaccurately, in order to highlight the allegedly destructive effects of the Arab invasions of North Africa, and misquoted him to suggest that there is an eternal antagonism between Arabs and native Amazigh people. For Gautier, Arab meant nomad and nomad meant barbarous destroyer. He was not aware, or pretended to not be aware, that Ibn Khaldun was using the word Arab in several different senses, sometimes as an ethnic term, sometimes as a lifestyle, sometimes as a material condition. In a colonial context, fueling that kind of antagonism between Arab and Amazigh people was extremely useful for the French to maintain a divide and conquer policy between Muslims. Because the existence of the French colonial empire in North Africa largely depended on the repression of any feeling of unity among local Muslim populations. One of the conditions of an empire's tranquility is the division of the population it has conquered. The division of what that empire considers as savages. On top of that, Gautier, just like other thinkers like Ernest Renan, was perceiving Muslims as stubborn children who had failed to evolve the way Europe had, and was fantasizing about how Ibn Khaldun was a genius with a modern and Western view of history, a lonely tree hiding a forest of supposedly barbarous and backward Muslim multitudes, stripping Ibn Khaldun of his Muslim and Maghreb identity, and seeing in him a modern French intellectual. Other Orientalists like William Marcet, an extreme supporter of French colonialism, who was also working for the Ministry of War in charge of indigenous affairs, had deployed their scholarship to segregate both Arab and Amazigh Muslims. However, during the Algerian War of Independence, a significant number of the experts of the Muslim world were teaching in Algeria but campaigned for Algerian independence, including the anti-colonialist militant Yves Lacoste, who was also opposed to the American aggression in Vietnam. He denounced French colonialists and their repeated attempts to create a fictional Ibn Khaldun, who was offering them bullets for the narrative of a North Africa ruined by the Arabs. Vincent Monteil was also one of those who opposed French colonial rule. He is mostly famous for fighting against Nazi Germany during World War II and protesting the French repression and systematic use of torture in Algeria. He had secret contacts with Algerian rebels and also campaigned for the Palestinians in his later years. He produced a new translation of the Muqaddimah with the aim of replacing Baron de Slam's version, by being closer to the spirit of Ibn Khaldun rather than the letter. Anyway, what is sure is that France was the first Western country that demonstrated a significant interest in Ibn Khaldun, although the motives behind that interest were questionable. But a century later, the English-speaking world would start to discover Ibn Khaldun and popularize his name furthermore.